Hello friends! The 621st day of the war between Russia and Ukraine continues. The enemy, with the support of aviation, does not abandon attempts to encircle Avdiivka. The morning report of the General Staff says that the defense forces repelled about 10 attacks by Russians in the area of the settlements of Stepove, Avdiivka, Sieverne and Pervomaiske. Ukrainian sources report continued pressure from the enemy in the Stepove area. According to the Ukrainian telegram channel Deep State, on the night from Saturday to Sunday, a significant number of Russians crossed the railway in the Stepove area. Part of the enemy personnel who survived the shelling is trying to gain a foothold in the forest belt west of the railway track. In the near future, the situation in this area will become clearer, but given the pressure, crossing the railway was only a matter of time. In the Vodane Opetne area, the situation is much more difficult than in Stepove. The enemy does not stop conducting daily assaults, periodically produce results. Now the enemy's goal is to get as close as possible to Sieverne and Pervomaiske in order to begin assault operations for the villages themselves, already with support of reserves, writes Deep State. My robot friend will continue further.
Ukrainian military observer Mashovets writes that the enemy continues to strengthen its group in the Avdiivka direction. Also, according to his data, the enemy has already taken a landing behind the railway near the northern part of the Avdiivka coke plant. Taking into account that the enemy does not stop trying to attack, as well as the fact that he continues to strengthen his group, it is quite possible to come to the conclusion that his command has not yet abandoned the implementation of its plans in the Avdiivka direction, Mashovets concludes. Another military observer, Butusov, writes that the Russians will soon begin a new assault on Avdiivka. The enemy has concentrated new fresh reserves and will once again try to attack the city itself directly and break through to the north and south of the city. Today the Russians launched massive air and artillery strikes. The tactical situation remains favorable for us since the enemy is advancing in much more difficult conditions than we are defending ourselves and are suffering many times greater losses. The Ukrainians are generally offering organized resistance. But many soldiers are tired because they destroyed several waves of attacks by the invaders. Our reserves also arrived, but not all units are coherent and have organization and controllability. Some newly formed units, it is difficult to gain a foothold in some small areas where you need to dig from scratch under fire, where at least a minimum line of defense has not been built in advance, where there are not even basic trenches and trenches. Avdiivka immediately needs ammunition and additional fresh and manageable reserve units. We can win in this battle, since it is difficult for the enemy to withstand such a high rate of losses. Avdiivka is the most important defense line in Donbas. All available resources and reserves, first of all, are needed here today, writes Butusov. In the Bakhmut sector, the Russian occupiers tried to restore the lost position in the areas of Klishchiivka and Andriivka, where our defenders repelled 5 enemy attacks, the General Staff reports. The enemy also conducted unsuccessful assault operations near Berkhivka, where 5 enemy attacks were also repulsed, the department says. Ukrainian telegram channels report that the enemy continues to put pressure on Klishchiivka, but an unexpected and rather unpleasant attack on the defense forces in the Berkhivka area, where, unfortunately, the Russians have had some success. Western experts, in addition to the advance of the Russians in the Berkhivka reservoir area, also record the enemy's advance in the Klishchiivka area. Meanwhile, the situation is developing at the front along the Dnipro River in the Kherson region. Over the past 24 hours, 87 aerial bombs were fired across the Kherson region, the largest number of all time, local authorities report. Officially, the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine practically does not comment on the situation. There are battles for the village of Kherson on the Russian-controlled eastern bank. The Ukrainian armed forces are in Kherson and the Russians are conducting attacks on the populated area. The main question is, what is the purpose of the battles for Kherson, as well as for several other small bridgeheads on the eastern bank that Ukrainian troops managed to occupy since the summer? There are two options. The first is targeted actions by sabotage groups of the Ukrainian army in order to divert reserves of Russian troops from other directions to Kherson. The second is preparation for a full crossing of the Dnipro with a subsequent offensive towards the Crimea. The second scenario, theoretically, the Ukrainian command can consider as an alternative to the stalled offensive on the Zaporizhzhia front. The Kherson section is less fortified than in the Zaporizhzhia region, since the Dnipro River itself is a natural barrier and line of defense. Therefore, if Ukrainian troops manage to cross the Dnipro, then in the future they will not encounter such multi-level fortifications as on the southern front. Another question is that there are no signs of large landing operations yet. Now we are only talking about securing certain groups of Ukrainian military on small bridgeheads that are under constant enemy fire, as well as the rear areas on the western shore of the Kherson region. It is objectively difficult to expand these bridgeheads so that they can become a point for an offensive, and so far this has not been possible if such a task was set. It will also be difficult to organize the crossing of any significant forces under fire from Russian troops. Interestingly, speaking of the landing operations across the Dnipro, the New York Times writes that within the ranks of Ukraine's armed forces there is discontent over decisions that were perceived as politically motivated. That is, the Ukrainian military, at least those with whom the American newspaper spoke, perceived the prospects of crossing the Dnipro with skepticism. But what could be the political motives for attempting to cross the Dnipro in this case? The most obvious answer, to use this to raise the morale of Ukrainians and demonstrate victories, is not suitable in this case. The Ukrainian command and authorities comment extremely sparingly on the events on the eastern bank of the Dnipro. And the first violin in covering these events is played by a group of Russian military telegram channels that previously supported Prigozhin and his rebellion, and also harshly criticized the leadership of the Russian Ministry of Defense. Moreover, they present the battles as almost the main events on the entire front and write about it in a rather alarming tone. Moreover, the situation in the Kherson region has already led to Russia changing the commander in this direction. The new commander was General Teplinsky, about whose conflict with the leadership of the Russian Ministry of Defense the military public wrote a lot at the beginning of this year. That is, certain processes are taking place in Russia in connection with the situation in the Kherson region. Whether the actions of Ukrainian troops on the eastern bank of the Dnipro are an attempt to influence these processes is still an open question. At the same time, I repeat, there is also a possibility that the Ukrainian armed forces are really preparing a large offensive across the Dnipro. This is what the Russians are now trying to prevent, and therefore are paying increased attention to this area. Meanwhile, a sniper of the Ukrainian armed forces with the call sign Grandfather believes that it is now impossible to reach the borders of 1991 due to the shortage of weapons. In his opinion, freezing the war with guarantees of real security for Ukraine may be an acceptable option to prepare for a decisive battle in the future. Personally, I won't be against this. And a number of guys with whom I talked, they won't be against it either. But we need an understanding to freeze on what conditions. Let's put up some kind of fence here and go our separate ways. Firstly, it won't work, have already frozen in the Donbas. Secondly, what really real security guarantees will Ukraine have in the near future if we freeze this conflict? What are the real plans of our government, first of all, and our Western partners so that our military-industrial enterprise will finally start working complex? What are the plans for replenishing the army, training the army, and so on? If this happens in order to prepare for a decisive battle, that's one question. But it's worse if this happens so that we again conditionally go into some kind of spiritual moral binge. They did absolutely nothing and then missed everything else. It is impossible now with what we have to go to the borders of 1991. Whether people like it or not. We will put another 200,000 of our fighters and will not go to the borders of 1991. Because the question is not about people, but about weapons, which we do not have. Russia is working, developing. What have we been doing for a year and a half? We still don't have a cartridge factory, said grandfather.
Friends, please support my channel if you like the video I provide, because making video is my full-time job. Thank you very much and see you in the next video.